Hello, good morning, good afternoon. Thank you all for being here today. Today is the 6th seminar of this Michaelmas term, and we're happy to have 3 speakers today. We have Dr. Jose Rosero Moncayo, Director of Statistics at FAO. We also have Dr. Piero Conforti, Deputy Director at Interim at Statistics Division at FAO. And we have our colleague, Frank Bolmer, from the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative here at the University of Oxford. And today, this seminar will be about measuring rural poverty with a multidimensional approach, conceptual framework, and empirical results. Happy to have you here, Dr. Jose, Dr. Piero, and Dr. Frank. Let me just give a couple of remarks before we start. It's about the logistics. So we'll have 40-minute presentation. We will start with Dr. Jose Rosero Moncayo, and then we will continue for a continuum 40-minute discussion, and then we will have the last 20 minutes for question and answers. So feel free to share your questions through the chat box, and we will be reviewing them and addressing them, all of them at the end of the session. The second remark is to let you know that the seminar is going to be completely recorded. It's being recorded even from now. So you can go back again to this presentation if you feel like. The presentation and the video is going to be available on OPHI's website. And we will welcome any questions or comment. Contributions are also welcome to this work. We appreciate if you try to make them concise so that we can hear for as many as you as possible. So without further delay, I just will give the floor to Dr. Jose Rosero.
No, thank you, Hector, and good afternoon, morning, depending on where you are, to all of you. So in this session, we are going to share with you the progress of the joint work of the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, the FAO, and OPHI, on defining a new metric to measure rural poverty. But before going to the mechanics of the metric, let us briefly reflect on why we are doing this. Okay, why do we want in the first place to focus and measure rural poverty? And at the same time, let us reflect on the gap that this metric is filling. Can we go to the first slide, please? First slide, please. Okay. So let us start by saying that poverty is predominantly rural. It's a rural effect, and that it affects in a disproportionate way the people and households engaged in agricultural activities. Now, also differences between monetary and non-monetary poverty are apparent. No matter what is the approach that we are using, we always arrive to a very clear conclusion. This is that rural poverty is more pronounced. So using a monetary metric, the one that basically uses the $1.9 PPP per day as poverty line, the World Bank found that 81.3% of the poor live in rural areas. Now, using a multidimensional approach, OPHI finds that out of the 1.3 billion people identified as poor across 105 countries, 85% live in rural areas. And the World Bank, using a similar approach, okay, a similar multidimensional approach, also finds that 83.5% of the people considered poor live in rural areas. Let's go to the next slide, please. So despite acknowledgement that poverty in rural areas is more pronounced than in urban areas, no comparable measure has been created, okay, that is tailored specifically to the characteristics of the rural area. So the current measures, the one that I have shown in the last slide, they neglect the distinction between the areas, under the assumption that they face the same set of living conditions. So therefore, one fundamental question is if there is a compelling case for measuring rural poverty from a conceptual framework that is compatible to the specificities of the rural sector in terms of deprivations and living conditions. Of course, our position in order to answer that question is that there is. And this is based on the evidence, on the abundant evidence that exists, that show us that the rural people livelihoods are different from those of the urban dwellers. They, for example, they live in more remote and sparsely populated areas. And that basically means that they have less access to networks, less access to services. They have lower social protection coverage, and also they face social assistance mechanisms and insurance that are often more informal. They also, in terms of livelihoods, depend more extensively on agriculture and the management of the natural resources. That this basically means that they face higher and different risks, the ones that are involved with the ecosystem, with the nature that they have around. In that sense, they are more under risk of potential effects of the variability of the weather and, of course, climate change. For all of these reasons, we believe that there is a compelling case to have a measure of rural poverty that has behind a different type of conceptual framework. Let's go to the next slide, please. Now, if we all agree that there is actually this case of having a specific measure of rural poverty, one still have to take into account different challenges in order to measure rural poverty. One of them is that there is no universal definition of what is rural areas. And this is not trivial. This is very, very important. So actually, if you go and see the data that exists, okay, in rural and urban areas, they use multiple type of definition. Different criteria exist in order to identify what urban and rural areas are. And they go from the most popular one, at least of what I have seen in terms of countries, that is to use an administrative approach that is explains more for historical or political reasons. And in that way, they divide the territory and define urban and rural areas to other more, let's say, objective criteria that are in function of population density or even distances from the so-called rural area from the densely populated areas. In principle, one would like to have one definition, an international definition of urban and rural areas that will allow us to have a unique assessment that is actually comparable, okay, across countries. But that doesn't exist. And in reality, but as well, the reality is that there is a great diversity among countries on how every single country conceives what is rural areas. There are diversity of agroecological characteristics, also differences of internationalization in the areas, difference in farming systems, availability of infrastructures, you name it. But the important thing to say is that most poverty assessments, and especially monetary ones, they fail to recognize and address this diversity, which of course also define different levels of well-being. Next slide, please. A related challenge is that we tend to think on urban and rural areas as static and also as a dichotomous variable, okay, a 1 or 0 variable. And this assumes that, that they don't evolve, okay? And that there is a way to make a perfect distinction between them. An area is either urban or rural. But the reality is that the variable is more of a continuous variable in which there are different degrees of rurality. And these different degrees of rurality are explained by a normal and evolving process of rural transformation in which the areas are more and more interdependent. As you will see along the presentation, this last thing of rural areas not being static and being more part of a continuum is something that is an unresolved issue, but nevertheless is worthy to take into account. Can we go to the next slide, please? Now, in one way or another, we firmly believe that, that the multidimensional approach is the most appropriate one in order to capture the specifics of measuring rural poverty. Why? Because it simply gives us the opportunity to include the specific dimensions that affect the conditions, the living conditions of the rural sector, such as we mentioned, the specificity of the livelihoods, okay, that exists in the rural sector. For example, the availability of specific assets, such as land or livestock, and also, of course, the different type of technology that they have. So the other specificity is, of course, the vulnerabilities of the rural livelihood to shocks, okay, and changes in the natural environment that has to do with climate variability, okay, and even the impact that climate change has on the activities in which they depend, especially in agriculture. And of course, the multidimensional approach, of course, allow us as well to take into account the availability of coping strategies, okay, and other means to manage risk that are very, very characteristic as well of the rural sector. With this introduction, I will give the floor to my colleague Piero Conforti to walk us through the way that we propose to calculate the multidimensional poverty index for the rural sector. Piero.
Thank you, Jose. Thank you. I will then proceed on this presentation. Basically, the point of departure in doing this work was the use of the Alkire-Foster methodology, basically the same methodology of the multidimensional poverty indices in general. So the first thing I would like to do is to quickly recap on this methodology, which with which probably many of you are already familiar. The starting point in this case is to select a pool of indicators, and for each indicator identify some deprivation cutoff, something that in a way defines the condition of deprivation. And this allows building a binary deprivation profile. So for each unit of analysis, we will have the conditions that define deprivation. Then this deprivation profile has to be weighted with a set of weights assigned to each indicator. And then the next step is choosing a cutoff that defines poverty. So we say that every person or every unit of analysis, person, household in this case, is considered to be deprived if their score is equal or greater than a certain value that we choose as a cutoff. In this case, we started working with the cutoff that is used by the global multidimensional poverty index, which is basically 0.33. 33% of the indicators are set in a status of deprivation, means that the unit of analysis, being it the person or the household, is considered to be multidimensionally poor. With these choices and with this material, we can compute basically two measures, which are a head count. Head count is just a proportion of population or units of analysis in the total number of units of analysis that are considered to be multidimensionally poor. And then we can compute an intensity, the intensity being a sum of weighted deprivation scores divided by the total number of multidimensionally poor people. And finally, the total multidimensional poverty index results from the multiplication of these two elements. One is by and large a head count, and another one is a measure of intensity. This is, of course, I don't need to say this, it's very well known, but I mean, this is, of course, is a very useful property because it serves the purpose of informing very well policy decision making, which is the ultimate reason why we want to work in this area and try to provide additional measure. In other words, having both something that takes into account how many people are in this deprivation condition, and at the same time, how intense is the level of deprivation of the people who are in this condition, are two elements that are very important in deciding policies. Again, so we want to build something that we call a rural multidimensional poverty index. Again, the point of departure is the global multidimensional poverty index that, as you know, the OPHI computes almost every year, I think every year actually, for a large amount of countries using the Demographic and Health Service dataset, which is a very rich dataset that has a number of interesting features. And the global MPI is based on the use of three dimensions: health, education, and living standards. Within each of these dimensions, the number of indicators is variable, but you have here a description. You see that in the health component, you have basically indicators of nutrition and child mortality. In the education, you have the years of schooling and the school attendance. And in the living standard, you have a number of features that define people's living conditions, like their house, the access to certain basic goods like drinking water, cooking fuel, sanitations, electricity, and so on and so forth. The idea here is that the weighting is such that assigns equal weights to each of the three dimensions. So we have equal weights for health, education, and living standards, and then the weights are distributed inside each of the dimensions according to the number of indicators that are there. So let's say the 1/3 weight that is assigned to living standard will have to be divided among 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 indicators, whereas this will not be the case for the other two dimensions. So this is a way that, of course, implies some choice, because it's not neutral to decide that health, education, and living standard do bear exactly the same weight. But let's say, it's a choice that we, in a way, did not discuss and decide to get along. Basically, in our case, at least, with the rural MPI, having no idea of how to assign different weights to the different dimensions. So here is the rural MPI. As Jose was hinting to before, there are at least two dimensions that are very important when we think about poverty in rural areas, and that are specific to rural areas. One is the dimension of livelihoods, so the specificity of the way people earn their living in rural areas. And at the same time, there is an issue of risks. So risks in rural areas tend to be different from those faced by urban dwellers. For this reason, we decided basically to take the global MPI and just to add two dimensions. So to leave something that speaks to health, let's say, or health and nutrition conditions that we, as we shall see in a minute, we modified slightly. Something that speaks about education, something that speaks about the living standards, just as in the global MPI. And then we added something that is a dimension on rural livelihoods, and something that speaks to the specificity of risk. So we basically added two dimensions here. And we try to follow the same logic in terms of weighting. So we assign equal weights to each of these dimensions. And we divided up the weighting of the specific indicator within each dimension according to the number of indicators, by and large, with few exceptions that I will be describing in a while. So more in detail, what did we do? For the what used to be called health and nutrition conditions, we modified a little bit. We call it food security and nutrition. We brought food security into this dimension for a number of reasons. One, because we believe it's an important condition, of course, not only in rural areas, but it's something that we tend to believe is quite important and is a type of element with which FAO works a lot. The second reason there is also that the type of data sources we have been working with have more frequently information available on food security rather than information on health. So in a way, it was easier to work on that. So we bent this slightly. And we use basically an indicator that speaks to the household probability of being severely food insecure beyond 50% using the households, the food insecurity experience scale that the FAO developed, and it is now indicator, SDG indicator 2.1.2, or it's the same type of indicator as this one. Is very close to it. It's not exactly the same, but it's very close to that. So we use this experience-based type of measurement of food insecurity, which works well at the household level, given that our unit of analysis was basically the household. In this case, you see that the weight is 1/10 for each of the two indicators. The other one is child malnutrition, built as on the basis of anthropometric indicators, underweight and stunting. In this case, I was saying the weights are 1/10 per each indicator, as there are only two indicators in the dimension. And of course, the weight assigned to each dimension is 1/5, given that we have 5. For the education, we didn't do much innovation compared to the global MPI. We just took the years of schooling. And this is the way we specifically dealt with it, by considering whether no household member in schooling age has completed at 6 years of schooling, and whether or not at least one household member in schooling age does not attend school during the reference period. So this is education. Living standard, again, they are pretty similar to what happens in the global MPI. We changed, topics are the same. Again, it's cooking fuels, sanitation, is access to drinking water, safe drinking water within a 30 minutes round trip walk, electricity, including solar energy, the type of floor and roof and walls materials that a household has available, and a number of assets like vehicles or refrigerators, bicycles, motorbike, all the way up to telephones or cell phones and things like that. So we didn't really change much here. Perhaps we change in some cases the deprivation cutoff, so the definition of the deprivation condition, upon the assumption that in rural areas a certain type of specification, say of the housing or of the cooking fuels, are more considered to be more frequent, hence more acceptable. At least, I mean, not necessarily more acceptable, but at least more frequent, so that one could say that with the relative poverty elements, one should not necessarily consider that as a deprivation and as an indicator of deprivation. Of course, the weights here are much lower, even there are 6 indicators in the dimension. Then about rural livelihoods and resources. First issue was looking at the livelihoods from the point of view of the available assets. So what assets the household has at its disposal to earn income, say things like land or livestock or similar things. Now here we shall see this is a bit of a challenge. We try to build an indicator that takes into account the share of income that the household derives from agriculture or from crop and livestock activities, and hence looking at whether the household has enough of the items that are necessary to produce these goods to earn a good living. So this was one element. The other element that was picked was the low pay rate. The low pay rate is a relative measure of the adequacy of the pay vis-a-vis the average pay of the sector in that area. And we took into account not only agriculture, but also a number of close by productive sector. We look at social protection from the point of view of the particularly of insurances, of social insurance. So we looked at whether any member of the household has access to a pension or another insurance scheme of a similar nature. We look at child labor. This is more children in employment, as a matter of fact. So looking at whether any household member below the age of 11 was employed. And we look at extension services, so the way, the possibility for household to access extension services. And weights in these dimensions are, of course, consistent with the 5 indicators. Finally, the dimension of risk. For the dimension of risk, we look at different, 3 different aspects. Let's say, first of all, we try to look at exposure to risk, exposure to big covariant risk, particularly the climate shocks. Here, we took georeference data, which come from a slightly different source, but could be adapted by linking the households with georeference variables and GPS coordinates. We tried to establish whether households were living in an area of with higher than the median probability of drought or floods or high temperature were possible, particularly in Malawi, so as to assess the exposure of households to covariant risk. Then we look at the exposure and coping strategies from the survey, particularly trying to see whether the household had been suffering a shock or a covariant shock, and what was the coping strategy to try and identify the negative coping strategy that would be a sign of deprivation. And then we had an indicator of credit denial that looks at whether a household has access to credit or not, or whether did not access credit for on the assumption of being exposed to a denial of credit or other reasons. So, of course, choosing these indicators implies a number of challenges, particularly for the assets in the livelihoods. Of course, it's difficult because choosing access to land or access to life, it run the risk that an indicator may or may not communicate deprivation in a household where that asset is not relevant. Or so this is the reason why we had to resort referring to income shares and the distributional aspect of assets vis-a-vis the income share. So the idea is that, again, if the household has a big income share from one activity, it has to have the assets that warrant the possibility of earning income in that area. Labor, yes, low pay rate is fine. This is one of the ILO decent work indicators framework, but indicators of the ILO decent work framework. The problem is that low pay rate doesn't really apply to family work, which is nonetheless very important in rural areas, so it has its limitation. And the same about children in employment. This is an issue with identifying the right age limit and an age limit that can work effectively across countries. Concerning risk exposure, as mentioned, we use this kind of georeference data, which work pretty well. Of course, the accuracy and the number of variables that one can take into account is different. It varies across countries. We had, particularly among the 4 countries we work with, more accessible information from Malawi, which was what we used. And the reason is that in that context, it's very easy to refer to one main crop, which is maize. And so the critical periods for maize imply certain risks for rural areas, which are pretty specific. The credit denial and the coping strategy. Of course, the credit denial, it's an interesting indicator. However, it doesn't really take into account all the possible informal ways in which credit can be received by rural households. Many times this goes through informal networks, which have nothing to do with the formal credit, although in some cases there is also the possibility, depending on the survey, of having a hunch on what, having information on what the informal network is conveying. And the same about coping strategies. Of course, there are some types that can be clearly identified as strategies that imply a negative position for a household, like being forced to sell assets or to change consumption patterns or things like this. But I mean, some may not be general enough in some cases. So these are, in a way, challenges associated with the choice of the indicator. Just let me specify that the choice of indicators was conducted through a thorough review of the literature and consultation of experts. Let's say there has been quite a lot of thinking beyond this, and all this will soon be consolidated in a product that will be accessible in the form of OPHI. So very quickly, the data. We worked at the moment with 4 surveys, which are essentially household surveys with a good level of information in agriculture. These are in rural areas, and these are the Ethiopia Socioeconomic Survey, the third wave, the Malawi Integrated Household Survey, the Niger National Survey on Household Living Conditions in Agriculture, and the Nigeria General Household Surveys for the years that you see that the samples always include a good share of rural households. Many of these surveys were conducted under the support, with the support and with the say the technical support as well of the World Bank, particularly of the Living Standard Management Studies. They are known many times as integrated surveys of agriculture because they are surveys that are households based, but they do include a lot of details in agriculture, which is of course what we were looking for. As we went through the surveys, and of course we searched for variables, we had of course modified slightly the weighting structure. So compared to the ideal weighting structure, you see that, for instance, in Ethiopia, we couldn't find an indicator of food security. What is food security? That was perfectly consistent with the others. Ethiopia has something similar to food insecurity experience scale, but not enough consistent with the others. So we just decided to rescale the weights in that case. Same thing goes for social protection information in Nigeria. That was not available, so that brought a rescaling of the weights for the rural livelihoods dimension. And same thing was for the credit denial in Niger. It was not available, in which case we reallocated the weights to the other indicators within the same dimension in order to run the calculation. I think I will leave it there and passing on to Frank, who will speak more extensively about the results. Frank, over to you.
Yes, thank you very much, Piero. I have now the pleasure to run through the results of the identification function for these 4 countries. Now, first of all, I want to acknowledge the statistics team and the FAO for computing these 4 countries, going through all the work to take a look at what indicators are available in all these surveys. So it's a lot of work that went into identifying for these 4 countries, these indicators. And the main results I want to present now are some of the main results that come out of the Alkire-Foster method, including the headline numbers, including some of the indicators, but as well as some of the statistical results that we get from redundancy and robustness analysis on indicators, and a fieldwork activity that is currently ongoing in Malawi. So let me start by the results of the headline figures, so to say. As Pierre was saying, the main numbers we get from the Alkire-Foster method for communication purposes is the headcount ratio, which is basically the critical mass of a population that is deprived in 33% in this case, classified as multidimensional poor. And you see that this stands next to the intensity, which is the average intensity of the deprivations only among the impoverished population. And if you multiply those two, you get the RMPI. Now, what's interesting here, obviously, is to look at the headcount ratio first. We see that the headcount ratios are quite high for Niger, Malawi, and Ethiopia. So particularly Niger almost has 100% multidimensional poverty headcount ratio. The one country that stands below that is Nigeria of 54%. Now we can compare this to the rural global MPI from the country when this was computed. Now we find, for instance, for the year 2016, when this data set was taken, and we compare this to the global MPI, to the rural areas, that there was even a higher percentage of population deprived, namely 90%. Niger, similarly though, was in the 96% range. So we find overlaps, but we also see some divergence to Malawi, for instance, and Nigeria in particular. Nigeria in 2015 in the rural MPI was 70% multidimensional poverty headcount ratio, whereas here we have 54%. Malawi is actually higher in the rural MPI. Now, overall, we take from this that this is indeed, in certain countries, we find a confirmation of patterns that we were, obviously, because we're using the same we build up on the structure of the global MPI, but we also see some divergence, which we investigate further. Intensities are similar with the exception of Niger, of course, around 50%, 45, 50%, with Niger standing out at 60%. Now, next slide, please. Yeah. Aside the population that we're looking into that is poor, that we call acute poverty, acute multidimensional poverty, which is the headcount ratio set at 33% in this exercise. There's of course also the population that is non-poor, but may be deprived enough to be classified as vulnerable to poverty. So if you are in 20 to 33% range of deprivations, weighted deprivations, then you are in the vulnerability category of poverty. And if you're actually exceeding 50% of the weighted deprivations, then you're in severe poverty. So we also computed aside the acute poverty, we also computed vulnerability to poverty and severe poverty. And what's interesting here is that those three countries, Ethiopia, Malawi, and Niger, that showed high acute levels of poverty, for obvious reasons, the vulnerability to poverty is lower versus severe poverty rate is quite high, particularly in Niger. This is slightly different in Nigeria, where the vulnerability is relatively higher, but we also have a lower level of acute poverty. Now, given the considerations of new indicators, of new dimensions, that might have some important policy implications. So if you're vulnerable to poverty and some of the results were driven by, let's say, the livelihood dimensions, then you might consider rather temporary interventions, temporary social safety nets, or you're looking into the hunger season or something like that. Whereas with the severe poor, you might have different policy approach. So we're thinking that this already has some interesting implications as to where the policy could set in. Next slide, please. Now, obviously, aside the headline figures that we have, headcount ratio, intensity, and the multidimensional poverty index, we can also look a little bit deeper and take a look at the individual indicators that maybe drive the results. And here we have three measures basically that are worth looking at. The first is the so-called raw or uncensored headcount ratio. That is basically the percentage of people in the population in that country that is deprived in each indicator. So you're looking at here at the moment just at deprivation, not at poverty, just deprivation by indicator. And overall, we have listed here the entire set of indicators. We have 18 across these four countries. Now, some patterns are interesting. So there are high uncensored headcount ratios in the standard living standards indicators. And here we're looking at cooking fuel in particular, electricity, housing, all standing out with more than 70% deprivation. In some countries such as Ethiopia and Niger in housing with 100%. And this is quite interesting. As Pierre was mentioning, we did adjusted some of these indicators to the rural situation. For instance, if you use burnt bricks, which in the global MPI is natural material, but it's very common in many rural areas, for instance, in Africa, then it would be non-deprived. And still we have a very high deprivation in this indicator, similar to cooking fuel if you had purchased firewood, for instance, but obviously we know that most rural households collect firewood. Of the new indicators, what is very interesting is the low pay rate. Now, the low pay rate attempts to measure wage employment, and it takes into account agriculture, but also other sectors. Mining is one, or I forgot which one the other ones were. But the results are rather low. We're taking into account ILO standard, and we see it is less than 10%. Malawi is different because Malawi has something called GANU, which is a temporary wage employment in agriculture, which is kind of short-term, semi-formal, but it is collected in the data sets, meaning that we have a greater share of households employed in wage employment. So that also means that you can fall into the low pay rate easily. So this, we know, drives the results. We see differences across indicators, across countries, in years of schooling, for instance, in child malnutrition. And this is something that you can also observe in the global MPI. But one interesting thing to observe is to look at Niger and food insecurity. Now, food insecurity works with the scale as Piero was describing. And although it's almost in a country with 100% multidimensional poverty rate, 96%, only 17% is deprived in this indicator. And that kind of highlights as well why it's important to not only look at the uncensored headcount ratios, but also at the censored headcount ratios, which we present in the next slide. Piero, please. Now, the second interesting element to look at is the censored headcount ratio, which is the indicator, the deprivation in each indicator, but only among those that were classified or as multidimensional poor. Now, so we're only looking here at the poor population. And what's very interesting then is to observe the percentage point difference between the uncensored that takes account of the entire population and the censored that only looks at the poor. Now, in our case, we find that in the first two dimensions, food insecurity, child malnutrition, year schooling, and school attendance, there is not much censoring taking place. That means that we have it befalls almost the poor equally as much as the non-poor in the population. However, in the living standards dimension, this is different for Ethiopia, Malawi, and Nigeria. So we have more censoring taking place, indicating, yes, that you can be deprived in these indicators, but not necessarily be multidimensional poor. Now, Niger obviously is a different, very, very, very high headcount ratio of poverty, so we didn't expect much censoring here. But interestingly, for Nigeria, which had a lower headcount ratio, we see that agricultural assets stand out with 13% censoring, extension services was 41%, and risk of climate shocks as well. Now, recall that risk of climate shocks is a covariate shock. So it befalls an entire rural area. So that really can mean that you can be deprived in that indicator, but not necessarily non-poor. So again, this is giving a little bit of indication as to what are indicators that really are driving the results for the poor population and what maybe drive the results for the entire population. Next slide, please. The next interesting element to look at is the percentage contribution to the rural MPI. So recall that the rural MPI is the headcount ratio multiplied by the intensity among the poor. Now, if we take the censored headcount ratio and multiply it with the weight of dimension or respective of the indicator, we get the rural MPI. So it mounts up to 100%. So it gives us a relative indication as to what drives the results even further. And we see if we're just looking at the dimensions, it is, I would say, fairly equal across the country. So with the exception of Malawi, we see that Ethiopia, Niger, and Nigeria, 30% are roughly in the living standards as the main driver at the dimension level. But obviously there are differences between the countries, but it's fairly even. That is different, however, if we go to the next slide, at the indicator level. Yeah. So what you see here is the percentage contribution by country. And that can be quite distinct. So in Ethiopia, the main contribution is the food security and nutrition, child malnutrition indicator with 14%. Now here recall that we didn't have the feast scale in Ethiopia. So this indicator gets the entire weight, meaning that explains it too. In Malawi, we have exposure to risk and food security with 14 and 13%. In Niger, it's years of schooling with 13%. Nigeria, vulnerability to risk of climate shocks as well. So what the point of this is that if you're going into each dimension and take a closer look at seeing what the results are, it can be quite different from country to country. Some being because of indicator availability and construction, and other reasons being that there are other drivers of multidimensional poverty in these countries. Okay, next slide, please. Now, obviously, we are currently still, and I'm aware of time, we're still in the verification and identification phase of this. We started with this work last year. We had a consultation in Oxford, a 2-day workshop. We went back, we implemented the work, and then the idea was to present it further. So the interest right now is obviously we could present more results on age, disaggregations, on ethnicity, what usually happens. But what we want right now is to take a closer look at the statistical validity of the new dimensions that are added, and as well to see what do we get back when we bring this to the field. So very briefly here, we did 2 statistical tests to test our new dimensions. The first is to analyze the indicators in these 2 new dimensions. Do they capture different population subgroups, or do they capture the same people? To that degree, we calculated something called redundancy, which is looking at the simultaneous overlap between indicators as a share, as a ratio of the indicator with the lower uncensored headcount ratio. So let's say you have one indicator with deprivation of 30% and one indicator of 50%. So you're taking the ratio of those 2. And if that ratio it ranges from 0 to 1, is high, 90%, then you know that 90% of those in the first indicator with 30% deprivation are also deprived in the other indicator. Now that could mean that you would merge indicators, that could mean that you drop indicators, but everything always needs to be considered normatively as well. Now we felt strongly about adding those 2 dimensions following our conceptual framework and following the consultation, but we still wanted to know whether or not the indicators do different, capture different subgroups of population. So we have the redundancy test and the Kramer's V, basically looking at the association between indicators. 2 things are worth noting. Social protection. We were able to calculate that in Ethiopia, Malawi, in Niger. And it shows ROs that are quite high. For instance, we have highlighted here Malawi in red, up to 96% with coping strategies. Now, obviously, in this situation, we've had a very high uncensored headcount ratio, relatively high uncensored headcount ratio in Malawi in this indicator of 75%. That means the higher the uncensored headcount ratio of the indicators, the more likely is that you are simultaneously deprived. So in this sense, we also have the Kramer's V, which is showing us that there's little correlation between the indicators. Now, we're still having that on the radar because it stood out. The other one is agricultural assets adequacy and low pay rate. The assets attempts to look at subsistence agriculture, whereas the wage employment looks more informal employment. So we were certain that those were 2 different population groups. And although in both cases, the uncensored headcount ratios were rather low. So had we have a big or high redundancy, it would have rang some bells. But we're certain that we have a 0.39 redundancy test result in Malawi, where we were most concerned about because of the field test. So we're very certain that there are different, not only kind of conceptually, but also capturing different subgroups. Okay, next slide, please. And I'll be very brief now, I think, in the interest of time. Now, we also did a robustness test right now. We did a robustness test looking at our selected cutoff line of 33%. So we used the global MPI cutoff line, and 33% means 1 dimension, weighted dimension in the global MPI. So the option would have been to lower the cross-dimensional cutoff line to 20, because we have in the rural MPI 5 dimensions. We intended to build up on the global MPI, but we wanted to know at the regional level for those 4 countries whether or not the results would be robust to changes in the cross-dimensional cutoff line. This is called first-order stochastic dominance analysis, where we computed for different K values the rural MPI and then plotted the results. Of course, at certain levels, you will have some terms of curves crossing, meaning the dominance is not maintained. However, we found that between 20 and 40% at the K range, we found relatively stable and good, robust results that the rankings in the subnational levels didn't change. So we took that rather as a confidence booster, that we can use this and maintain the vulnerability to poverty category and later severity. Piero, would you skip the next slide, because it's another robustness test, but we can go further. Okay, so these are the last slides. Basically, we have done the computation the statistical validation. We also now are in the process of validating the results in the field test in Malawi. This was meant to have happened in May, but due to the pandemic was postponed. In partnership with the University of Malawi Zomba Center of Social Research, we implemented in September and October, overall not really, but this is really embedded and really the work of the colleagues in the field who have taken all precautions and really kind of great work going to different parts of the country, implementing 64 focus group discussions in 8 different sites across the 3 regions in Malawi. And the idea was to really identify what dimensions and indicators do the impoverished population that we know in rural areas, what they would choose. And they're still in the write-up, it's still in the validation process, but some preliminary results can be presented. First, Piero, please, next slide. At the dimensions level. Okay, so we had 64 focus group discussions, and we were reported back that the 5 dimensions were mentioned quite frequently. Most importantly, most frequently, food security conditions, living standards, and then livelihoods and resources, education and risk. Sorry, education, risk and coping. So risk and coping was mentioned less often from the new dimensions, but it is, we were analyzing this right now as to the reasons. One new dimension came up, which in form of nutrition. Yeah, and here I think that speaks to food security as well in the way that it looks into the adequacy and quality of food consumed. And we will need to take that into consideration when we're revising the NPI. Next slide, which is I think the last. Yeah. And some important feedback already on the indicators. So we were reported that most of the new indicators were mentioned, some after probing, but many also without probing. So, for instance, ownership and the use of land, or the access to agricultural inputs. You can see it here on the right side. Now, important findings here are that land is important to access, but also it's important to farm it, to ability to really farm it. So we would also need to take into considerations, agricultural extension services, for instance. Livestock was also an important finding, although not listed here. It is very interesting that livestock ownership is very diverse, but it reverses to well-being status and can be quite different in parts of Malawi. For instance, most of the fieldwork took place in the southern region, and cattle was very rarely owned. So it didn't as much showed up as you might expect in other parts of the country. And this highlights the complications of really capturing agricultural assets, productive assets, to measure livelihood, because you might not have it because it's a livelihood choice. Additional indicators came up in form of physical appearance, clothing and beddings, for example. So we will need to take account of these too. But overall, we were getting the feedback that we have a good start. Yeah, that many of the new indicators can be used, but we would need to use maybe some proxies, or we need to think about how to really implement well the kind of to capture the deprivations that we want to capture. Okay, this being said, I would now pass back to Jose to give an overall maybe conclusion as to where we stand with this exercise. And over to you, please.
Well, thank you, Frank. And I will do this very briefly because, unfortunately, we are against the wall in terms of time. But well, of course, at the moment of doing this, at the moment of putting together the multidimensional poverty index for the rural sector, we wanted to check if at the end the metric that we are proposing actually captures what we want to capture. That is basically the specificities of the rural poverty according to our conceptual framework. In that sense, as Frank has shown, the empirical results are encouraging. Okay, so we have low redundancy. The added dimensions have high contributions It was very important for us to bring this to a field test in order to validate what we consider from the theoretical point of view being important dimensions. And we have also been successful on doing that, at least in Malawi. But of course, yeah, I mean, we cannot have enough. So most likely we would like to have more testing as well. So that's something basic to still do. We would like to test further our proposed index with the experience of other countries as well. Now, another issue is the issue of scalability of the index that we are proposing. How scalable it is, how we can do in order to upscale the measurement in a way to be able to build a global indicator. In that sense, of course, the reality is that with the information that we have right now, with the amount of surveys that we have right now and information inside of that survey, right now we are facing limitations, okay? As you know, there is the important trade-off between the consistency that we want to have in the measurement, and of course the amount of information that is available in the survey. So we are thinking in all this type of global data collection efforts that can help in order to get the data that we need in order to be able to compile the indicator as it was defined and it has been tested, without going to the extreme of having to take in out dimension just because the data is not available right now. On this, basically, we have our hopes very much high with one specific initiative, that is the 50 by 2030 initiative, which is a survey program that the FAO, the World Bank, and IFAD are putting together in order to be able to collect data on the rural sector. The objective is to be able to collect information of 50 countries, 50 of the low and low middle income countries around the world by the year 2030. So that's the way basically that we see that this effort can be scaled up in a way to have something that is as close as possible at having a global monitoring and report. Thank you very much, and looking forward for some questions.
Thank you very much, Jose, Piero, and Frank. It's been a very interesting discussion, and as you can see, there are many questions. Unfortunately, we're almost close to the end, but we will extend a few more minutes so that we can address some important questions. I will group them first in three, because these are very clear clarifications. One, regarding the urbanization process, I guess the question is, which definition of rural areas are you exactly using? Because as Jose mentioned, there are a few definitions there. So just to clarify which one is it. And then there's someone raising an observation about Ethiopia and about the uncensored headcount ratio. So in food insecurity. And then the third one is another clarification. How could you elaborate a bit more, but briefly, on the indicator that you use about food security, in particular, how is the probability of being severely food insecure is considered? But these are just very simple clarifications. It may not take you longer. There are other questions that maybe we can address if you can quickly react to this, if it's possible, and then we can continue with another group.
I'm happy to take these questions very quickly. Before doing that, just allow me to mention that this work is the result, and I wish I would have mentioned this before. I should have been mentioned before. This work is the result of a work of a number of teams that involve many people. I cannot now quote all of them, but there are several colleagues that have worked with us, both in Rome and in Malawi. And so I just wish to mention that we are presenting, but there is a whole team of people that has been doing very good work. So, okay, the definitions of rural. We could not do anything but work with the definitions that are used in the survey. And the definition of the surveys are the national definitions. So they suffer exactly from the very challenge that Jose expressed at the beginning, the fact that those definitions are not homogeneous. So whatever you call a rural area in one country turns out to be a rural area. We couldn't really modify that because basically the sampling weights and everything in the survey is geared to those definitions. So we cannot change them. Ethiopia. Well, I saw the question in the chat. That's simply the fact that we have no indicator of food insecurity for Ethiopia. That's why you see a 0 and 100% for the other one. It's just that the information is not there. So let's say, strictly speaking, that 100% is not very useful, but that's the reason. And finally, the indicator of food insecurity. On this, I will not be able to give a comprehensive reply. I would invite the person to visit some of our website where the definition is explained in detail. So this is the food insecurity experience scale, and there is an SDG indicator, which is SDG indicator 2.12, which is defined as the moderate or severe food insecurity based on people's experience. Is essentially a technology that uses 8 questions about experience of people with food insecurity, objective experience. And then this information is processed with a latent trait estimation model, particularly with the Rush model, to come up with a probability of being severely or moderately food insecure. This is the information we are taking. Is a relatively new indicator, which we are working, our division is working towards, let's say, spreading and computing in many countries in the world. And we believe it's a very effective indicator of the household level. So I think these are the questions, these are the answers, and of course I'm here for further clarification. So I don't know if Jose or Frank wants to over.
Thanks, Piero. Just let me continue very quick with another group, perhaps the last one. If we have time, maybe a couple more. But one is concerning the risk dimension. So it's relative to the denial of credit. One question is, why do we have a different weight to credit denial versus the other 2 risk indicators? Is there any norm? Of course, it's a normative decision, but I presume it's related to the fact that the others are more connected to the risk of being the risk exposure rather than a structural institutional situation that can be addressed by policy. But maybe we can discuss this. So why differential weights within this dimension? And the second one is, so this access to credit also consider formal and informal credit access. Somebody was mentioning mobile access to mobile credit or mobile financial resources. How is this addressed? There was another question regarding the scaling this exercise, which is capturing a lot of attention to a larger set of countries, given the fact that you are using a very rich data set, the LSMS family. But I think Jose already mentioned what are the restrictions. So just to mention that, and to conclude, well, this at least this set, or potentially the whole seminar, depending on the time. What would be ideal variables that you would like to have and you didn't include, because many of the participants are working on a statistical offices, so maybe you can mention something related to that, and maybe we will conclude with this set of questions, and take advantage if you want to say something else before concluding.
Yeah, so maybe very briefly on the credit denial indicator. Now, it was giving a lower weight, and we debated long about it because it has a subjective element to it. So if you're looking at it, it's kind of, you didn't seek credit because you believed you wouldn't get it. So it's a bit of, it had a kind of subjective element to it. And just because of this, usually we would give less weight in these situations because they're kind of more subjective and they're placed next to indicators that we felt were stronger to capturing the relative deprivation that we tried to capture. In terms of maybe the other question I cannot remember, the ideal variables. There are definitely many, and I think Jose and Piero can come in if you like. I mean, particularly with livelihoods, what we thought in this indicator was to take a look at the agricultural specialization, but also livestock specialization or fishery specialization or forestry specialization. There is always like more in terms of productive assets with different groups of rural populations that we wanted to include. So at the moment we're looking strongly at agriculture, but obviously also other rural population subgroups, other assets included would be fantastic. Maybe Piero, do you like to?
Just to complement that, so of course, in order to put together this type of exercise, you have to get some kind of commitment, right? So on one hand, you would like to follow a conceptual framework and to implement that conceptual framework as free as possible, right? Because in the ideal world, you will have access to perfect instrument, to perfect tools, having all basically the variables that fit into conceptual framework. But of course, the reality is not like that. So you are constrained with the data that is available and the surveys that has been collected in the countries that you are interested. So at the end, it's a commitment between the respect to your conceptual framework versus the data that is there in order to be able to say something that is meaningful. Nevertheless, we wanted basically to be as close as possible to our conceptual framework. Okay, so even if the data was not available there, we wanted to be as close as possible to our conceptual framework. That's why you see basically here the results applied to a specific set of countries. Okay, so it's not that we don't want to present results of other countries. It's actually that we don't have the data to process it in other countries. Okay, so that's basically a reflection of how close we wanted to be to the conceptual framework. And this brings us to the topic and the problem of the scalability of this effort. Of course, from FAO point of view and having the mandate of eradicating rural poverty, we would like to monitor this at the global level. Okay, but in order to do that, we need to have the tools and the instruments, the survey tools that are needed in order to collect that data. How we are going to do that? One way is I mean, we have our hopes high, as I mentioned, with the 50 by 2030 initiative. But of course, we would like to see other type of data collection initiatives getting the information that it is embedded in this proposal to be able to measure this indicator and measure progress. Oh.
Yes, indeed, just to follow up on what Jose and Frank have said, just to mention that, of course, more than an ideal indicator, we would like to have an ideal survey that has a coverage comparable to one of the DHS, which is by no chance the one that OPHI uses to measure the global MPI. Unfortunately, we don't get something like this that is more geared to the rural areas and to dealing with rural areas. We wish we would have that, but that information base is not yet available. So we have to make the best out of it. I think, though, that with some reasonable compromises, the indicators can be upscaled more counties, and this is what we are working towards, also because there is quite a significant demand for the use of indicators of this sort in policy implementation and policy work. So this is what basically motivates our interest in this area. Thank you, and over.
Well, thank you very much. There is interest on knowing if there is a link to the Rural MPI project. I presume that this document is still a work in progress, but I encourage participants to look for it when the paper is available. I just want to thank you all for your clear exposition and for your opportunity to extend this seminar 10 minutes more. Jose, thank you very much. Piero, Frank, thank you very much. And I'm gonna conclude this seminar. I'm gonna thank to all participants, and just to invite you to the next presentation, which will take place next week. We will talk about endogenous weights and multidimensional poverty, something that was in a way discussed in this seminar, where Dr. Gaston Jaloneski from the University of Leeds will participate. Thank you to Piero, Jose, and Frank again, and see you next week.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.